Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. See some familiar faces here? Great. Good afternoon. My name is Kenneth Tan. I'm coming from Sardina Systems. So today, I want to talk to you about a very boring topic. It's VMware migration. So, all of you familiar with this ancient thing called VMware? Oh, come on, I get no answers. Yes, great. Okay, so, flow of today's presentation, we'll talk about what are the considerations, some of the planning points, and then how do we test it, an example of how we've done it at one of the financial institutions in Southeast Asia. So, OpenStack and migration from VMware to OpenStack. Is it complicated? Why yes? Why not? So, first off, migrating from VMware to OpenStack, this is significant. It's significant not just from a technical perspective, but also from an operational and organizational perspective. Three most important things in migration: human factor, human factor, human factor. We'll come across this over and over again throughout migration projects. And so, in a way, migrating VMware, this is not much more different than migrating similar large projects, similar projects that have a lot of history behind it. And this kind of projects, first requirement is there a will? Does the organization actually have a will to migrate? There is a will, there will be a way. And if within the organization, there are people who would say, nah, I'm not too interested, that's going to cause problems. So you need people to be on board. And there are some key differences as well that we all need to be conscious of before we start a project. So one of the major differences, and I'm not going to list all the differences here, okay? So one of the differences is that VMware is very flexible. It allows you to arbitrarily define what the VM definition would be. And this is not something that you see in cloud platforms. When I say cloud platforms, whether it's OpenStack, it's AWS, GCP, whichever, we all have this flavor concept. VMware doesn't. And another thing that we need to take into account, and this is something also what we have come across repeatedly, is backup. How do we handle backup? Backup from whose perspective? Backup from the operator perspective, or backup from the service consumer perspective? Because whilst in VMware, there is no clear separation between who's the operator, who's the service consumer. Whereas in a cloud model, you have this very strong, clear-cut operator versus service consumer, where the operator's responsibility is on keeping the entire system running, not necessarily concerned about what happens inside individual VMs. Whereas the service consumer is only interested in their workloads. What happens in the infrastructure? None of their business. They don't really care. Yeah? And then another thing that we see quite often as well is With VMware, you can do pretty much everything from a single console. The fact that underlying it is still a Linux, you don't need to be concerned about that. But in OpenStack, you need to. So still need the understanding of what's happening at hypervisor level. And very likely, you're going to need high Linux administration expertise to run OpenStack. But the good news is, if you're working with a OpenStack distribution that is well architected, you should be able to run with no more expertise than Linux admin expertise. Okay? So now, some other differences is that with VMware, yes, you do have VMware Cloud Foundation, which provides you with a self-service cloud-based operations model, but not all the sites use VCF. And as I mentioned a moment ago, OpenStack has a very strong self-service cloud operations model. Okay? So let's look at how do we structure such a process. We all know this. VMware has been around for a long, long time. Some of these VMs, they've been around for a long, long time too. And some of them, I may not even know what's in there. And then it also gets interesting because sometimes the client just wants to continue using the tools that they have been using in VMware without actually thinking clearly as to, is this operator role or is this service consumer role? And seem to be mixing that. And so these things need to be considered as well. And yes, it's a good idea if the client have paid for existing tools to maximize the investment, but perhaps you also need to step back and think, is the tool still relevant? Maybe the tool isn't relevant anymore. Okay? So, and of course, with anything that's been around for a long, long time, you're going to get organizational behavior, organizational habits, and yeah, there's a lot of, I don't know why, but I've always done it this way. And also with anything that has human factor involved, there's going to be political interest potentially in lots of different directions within an organization. And yep, they don't need to be reasonable. So as an anecdote, anyone still running Windows 98? Ancient stuff, yeah? We've come across this at a customer site with VMware. I'll come back to this later on. So, because we're planning a new system, therefore we're going to be implementing a new system. And then somebody is going to say, oh, no, I don't like new systems. I want that thing that looks like VMware, feels like VMware, just cheaper. Just not VMware, but it needs to behave just like VMware. So you get that too, right? And on networks, we need to think quite clearly. Will the VMs be retaining the same IPs, or they'll be assigned new ones? And sometimes the client doesn't know. Sometimes the VM has been there for years. Nobody's touched it. The guy who originally deployed it left the company 10 years ago. And what's in there? Who knows? And so if you do need to have the IPs kept, you really need to plan for it. Okay? And next question that comes up is often storage. Can and will existing storage systems be used? And are we talking about integration using iSCSI, fiber channel, NVMe over fabrics, or just plain simple NAS? And you also come across questions like, well, how will the provisioning mechanism be done? And what about the credentials of the storage backend? And we've come across a case where questions were being asked about, yeah, sure, OpenStack, just like VMware, you need to provide the credentials for talking to the storage backend. But with VMware, after you enter the credentials on the dashboard, you no longer see the plain text anymore. Does it mean that the plain text is not there? No. But the client says, in OpenStack, I don't want to see the plain text there. How do you hide away that plain text in OpenStack when Cinder needs to talk to the backend? Reasonable or not? And yeah, we're going to have to determine the order and time for transferring the VMs. And so because you're going to have to do that, are the application owners actually on board with this? The last thing that you want is to plan a migration. Yep, we are going to migrate this set of VM on the first weekend of April, only for the application owners to come on a Friday afternoon going, hold on guys, what are you doing again? Oh, no, my application can't be migrated. And there goes your schedule. Yeah? And this sounds funny, but yeah, they may not be so certain that the application will still come back up. And yes, we're talking about 2025, and they still don't know if the application may come up or not. Okay? So, and then when it comes to data transfer, there's no magic. If you need to move the data, you need to move the data. You cannot say, well, you know, I need to move the data, but I want it faster. I'm very sorry, there's no magic. So what we need to consider is, can we clean up unnecessary data before migration to reduce the amount of data that we're going to transfer? And with that, we can speed up the migration process. Yeah? So So now, remember, a 10 gig network, 10 gigabit per second network, at best, you're going to move 1.25 gigabytes per second. So in an hour, ideal condition, you're going to move 4.5 terabytes per hour. And this is one shot. You're not sharing network, no multiplex or anything. Right? So it may seem obvious, but yeah, some people expect it to be quicker. So I always remind, that's your hard limit. No magic. And then there's the question of downtime or minimal or no downtime. So we can minimize the downtime by doing an incremental transfer approach. This is going to be using the VMware's NBD client. And the trade-off really is how much do you value your data? Are you willing to play with fire or not? Maybe you say, this data is not so critical. I'm willing to gamble. Then you can place your bets and gamble. But if you don't want to gamble, stop the VM, take out the disk, the virtual disk, and then migrate. Okay? And indeed, this is our recommendation, that stop the VM so that you get a consistent image, and you can then pull out. Whilst the original VM is actually not touched. So now when it comes to planning OpenStack, OpenStack has a nasty reputation. Why does it have a nasty reputation? Because there's been too many people trying to spin consultancy around it, trying to spin services around OpenStack. So deployment process, geez, I've seen vendors pushing for deployments that take months. Come on, guys, this is 2025. You should be able to do OpenStack deployment in an afternoon. Consulting, an afternoon worth of consulting. Better. Turn the deployment into a fill in the config file, hit run, and go for lunch. That should be how it's done. So, consulting, think twice. And then, the migration process. Yep, this is yet another situation where there are lots of vendors pushing for consulting. Think twice also. And a product-driven approach does not necessarily mean that there is no services that comes along with it. Because if you think about it, the product vendor wants you to use the product. So they don't get paid if the product doesn't work, right? And so as you go on, you got to be thinking much further ahead in OpenStack Live. How would you upgrade the system? Again, are we talking tools? Are we talking software? Or are we talking yet more consulting? Yeah. And so then when we look at migration, one thing that you got to do is you start with a test VMs. Try it out. See how that goes. And the process should be one that is automated to handle the transformation step in between. And this test migration is going to get you a much more realistic data transfer time as well, and get you to understand what's the actual performance impact on network and hardware. So now, when you are taking the VM out from the VMware system, some things that may not necessarily be up front and center is that you got to be thinking what's the connectivity between the VMware system and the storage backend, because you got to pull the data out, right? And then what's the connectivity between the VMware system and the node where you are running the transformation process before you put that transformed image into OpenStack. So at that point, we're going back to what you looked at earlier, 4.5 terabytes per hour. That's a 10 gig network, right? And then on the other side, you're gonna have to take that transformed image, you're gonna put it into OpenStack, and that again involves network, because now you got to put that image into the storage backend. You got to consider the time transfer between the OpenStack system and the migration worker node as well. Yeah? And so at least you got to be looking at 4 trips of data. And so your 4.5 terabytes per hour is beginning to look much more like 1 terabyte that you're actually going to be moving. Yeah? And so along with that, of course, we need to think about what's the VM size, amount of data to be written. For Windows VMs, we've got to be thinking about VirtIO. And there is a package to install onto the Windows VMs so as to get the VM running on the OpenStack side. With our approach, this step is handled automatically. And we've talked about the downtime from the VMs being shut down. But this is something that even though we highlight to the client, sometimes it doesn't necessarily register in people's minds. They'll come up and say, oh, I wasn't expecting downtime. Yes, it was written there in the migration plan. And sometimes your migration is actually not to migrate. Do a redeploy. And then use load balancer to route the traffic to the new VM. And some other times, we look at migration that could be problems from network drivers or some other VM configuration that would then prevent it from actually starting on the OpenStack side after we do all the transformation process. And with these type of cases, very often you got to be looking at manual troubleshooting. And on the operator side, on the infrastructure side, you got to be looking at monitoring the infrastructure, but the content in the VM, if you are the operator, that's not your LAN. You can't touch it. That's service consumer, okay? And so it's then up to the service consumer to check whether the data is intact or not. And this is where we again go back to the approaches whether we shut down or we don't shut down. You're the operator. Are you going to play with fire or not? Because if you play with fire, your users may come back and say, whoa, hold on a second, the data is not intact. And so what about other client expectations? Site recovery. Anyone familiar with VMware site recovery? Wonderful feature which VMware charges per VM. But in OpenStack, because you're looking at it from an operator perspective, when you're talking about site recovery, this is assuming the entire site has gone dark, which you then need to recover the entire site at an alternative site. And that's what you've got to be looking at. Recover full set of VMs. You can't differentiate between them. Or you've got to be looking at recovering on a per VM basis using something like Masakari. Okay? And disk resize, perhaps a simple matter, but CPU memory hot add, question mark, question mark, question mark. Why? Because in OpenStack, first and foremost, it's flavor-based. So, but does it mean that it's impossible? No, it isn't. But it's not out of the box, okay? And what about something like DRS to optimally pack the VMs and allocate resources accordingly? I don't want this to be a product pitch, but there's a reason why our company name is Sardina, okay? Talk to me after this, and I explain. So, example of how it's done. So, using Lego blocks, Lego building block style of system configuration, so you can then very quickly specify the hardware needed for the new system. And with that, we can have the systems built in factory, which by the time it gets delivered to a data center, it's already pre-deployed, and you get going very quickly. Alternatively, client has the hardware, and we guarantee that the deployment is done within 2 weeks. And yet, if my guys are taking any more than a day to do it, I know there is trouble somewhere. Okay? And we do this with a tool called FishOS Move It, which can then take the whole set of VMs in one go, or it can be done in a selective manner. This is a presentation about VMware, but if any one of you are dealing with Hyper-V as well, talk to me. So we have a very well-traveled path to go from the concept, planning, to deployment, all the way to a post-deployment operations and upgrade process that will often work with service providers, work with customers, plan out the whole thing. Okay? We're short on time today, but any one of you interested, I can walk you through these in more detail. And similarly, as I mentioned, with the hardware, we have predefined Lego building block style of configuration, which you can then quickly define the system to be used. So this is an example of a customer case in Indonesia. It's a company called Federal International Finance. They are a leasing company. We work with them defining the hardware, and then get to deploying the OpenStack, and then handle the migration from OpenStack. And so the process, in this case, it's a very old network, 2 hours per 300 gig VM. Sounds like a dog slow record, eh? That's not unusual in real enterprise environments. Okay? And yeah, what tell you about the funny case of Windows 98. Why Windows 98? So this customer, they are a manufacturing company. They manufacture certain FMCG products, very, very popular in their country. And when they put in these machineries to make the products, they want the machine to keep running. Don't want it to stop. Because every hour that this thing stops, it's production that's at risk. It basically means they don't make money. That's a bad thing, right? Technology be damned. It's the machine that needs to keep running. Yeah? And so, thing is, they have a VM that controls the machinery. And the machinery, once they put in, they want it to run for 30 years. And guess what? Windows 98 is not 30 years yet. So, yep, got to be looking at migrating Windows 98. Yes, it's possible. Do Windows 98, there's a lot more that you can do in between. Okay? And oh yeah, this was a real comment from a customer that we've encountered, and it's a bank. Funny, huh? So this is part of what we've got to go through with the client, educate, talk them through. There are certain things that you've got to be aware of, certain things that's possible, certain things that's not possible, certain things that are actually done better on OpenStack side. Okay? That's it. Questions from anyone? Happy to answer them.
Okay, so I think we have like time for one question.
Great. If you want to talk to me after this, happy to talk.
Okay, so I think thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Mr.